about being a certain amount of humbling effect standing up here, knees knocking and so forth, and that does occur from time to time, as in this time right now. But you always appreciate it when people tell you that you said something that was of interest to them and pertinent to their life and spiritual well-being or whatever. And but you can also, as we know in any endeavor in life, if somebody gets too fond of praise, especially in this position, when you look out over this crowd, I come to realize one time when I got to thinking about it that, and literally this applies to me in this crowd, that when I can look out over a crowd, and there's people that's changed my diaper in the past in it, and there may be people sitting in it that will change my diaper in the future due to the nature of mankind, then that's a pretty humbling thought. And really that applies to about any crowd you get in. So if you get to thinking you're pretty important sometime, just think about that. Coincidentally, the song we sang about Christ paying a debt he did not owe and us owing a debt we did not pay, we're going to talk a little bit about our indebtedness to each other and the vested interest we have in each other's spiritual well-being. Mitch's lesson this morning reflected on the fact that Christ gave up more probably than we can even remotely understand in order to come to the earth and to take the place of the things that we have done as far as dying for our sins and whatever. And in so doing that, he has a vested interest in our spiritual well-being. Now, we are indebted to Christ for that, and he expects a certain amount of, not a certain amount, a whole lot of application of his word to our lives in order that we may live the way he says we should, in order that we can live up to the expectations he has of us. Two or three examples we have in the biblical examples we talk a little bit about are Eli, Samuel, and Saul, the first king of Israel. In 1 Samuel, the first few chapters, it talked about Eli, who was the priest of God. Now, Eli was obviously a man of God because he was in a position that he could do the things that God wanted him to do and was in a position of being in communication with the Lord. And when the time came for him to do these things, he carried out his duties. But we are introduced to Samuel in the first chapter of 1 Samuel, and Samuel, or not to Samuel, but to Samuel's parents. Hannah was his mother, and she had been childless, and Samuel was pledged to God through Hannah's prayer, which is recorded in the first chapter of Samuel. She pledges that Samuel will be a child to God and will be of service to him from the time that he's born, really, until his death. And once he is weaned, she takes him and turns him over to Eli, who trains him and takes him and makes him a man of God also. Eli, as with all things, you know, when we talked about the children of Israel before, as they came out of the land of Egypt and whatever, because the fact that God told the children of Israel that they would have everything that they wanted if they did what he told them to do, if they abided by the principles that he said, if they conquered the people that they came upon, and if they then lived by the laws that he gave them. He told the same thing to Eli, in its essence, that the priesthood or the judgmentship that he was giving for these people would be carried out through his family. But the problem was Eli did apparently not have his children in subjection in the way that he should, because his sons disobeyed the commandments of God. And in fact, in verse 12 of chapter 2, they're called, the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. Of course, it goes on then to say of the priest's custom at that time to take a portion of that was offered in the sacrificially, which is the way the Levitical priesthood was taken care of. But instead of going through the process as they should, the sons of Eli went about it in a way that God did not approve of. They just said, well, we're going to take it before we go through the process or not. As a result of that, in the verse 30 of chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, God says, be it far from me, for them that honor me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days come that I will cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house, that there shall not be an old man in thine house. Thou shalt see an enemy in my habitation, and all the wealth which God shall give Israel, and there shall not be an old man in thine house forever. And the man of thine, whom I shall not cut off from thine altar, shall be to consume thine eyes and to grieve thine heart, and all the increase of thine house shall die in the flower of their age. Now, this goes on to happen because a little later on the same day, in battle, Eli loses both of his sons, and he himself dies when he hears of this tragedy. In chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, when we start talking about Samuel, God comes to him in a dream, you would say, or he comes to him to speak to him, and Samuel's asleep, and he wakes up and he goes into Eli and asks Eli, why did you call me? And he doesn't. Eli said, well, and me. He said, go back to bed. So he went back to bed, and it happens again. He goes back again. Eli said, well, and me. He said, go back in there and wait this time. And he said, when this voice speaks to you this time, he said, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. Well, he does. And he tells Samuel in that time in chapter 3, verse 11 through 13. And the Lord said, Samuel, behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of everyone that heareth it shall tingle. And that day I will perform against Eli all things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. For I have told him that I will judge in the house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. And he restrained them not. Now there's significance there in the fact that he had a obligation and an indebtedness to him, to those kids, to make sure that they went the way that they should, but he restrained them not. It also implies that he had the power to do something about their actions. He didn't have the power to make them, but he had power to point out to them that their actions were wrong, which apparently he did not do, because God takes this away from him. Well, Samuel was scared about this, and he is kind of afraid to tell Eli that. But he does go and tells Eli what God has told him. And when he does that, Eli replies that, this is God that says that, and so that's the way it will be. So Eli knew all along, apparently from his actions, that the things that he was doing was not correct according to what God wanted, but that he also was responsible in a way, and therefore he was going to do what it was said, because God said that was the way it would be. So Samuel became the leader of Israel, so to speak, and he moved into a position that would be enviable by some, but on the other hand, it was a very responsibility-filled position, and a thing that you could not say was easy for him to carry out. So he goes through there, and the people of Israel at that time, Eli had an interest in Samuel because he had brought him up in the ways of the Lord. Samuel had an interest in Eli and an indebtedness to him to honor him for the things he had done for him. Now Samuel's in the position that Eli was in before, and he's taking that position into going to it about that he will be the leader of these these Israelites. Well, of course, as Israel is known, from the very beginning, mankind has been very predictable. We talked about in our class in there not long ago about, the fact that omniscient eyesight is 20/20 in every direction. Now, what that means is, a lot of times you have the question brought up about whether or not that some character, for instance, Judas, or some other character that has done wrong and that is recorded in the Bible, if God had the power to do all this stuff, then why didn't he make this thing different? Or did he predestine someone to do that? Well, just because it's prophesied or talked about and God has the power to know it doesn't mean that it was providential that it happened. And the reason to say that is because mankind is so predictable that you wouldn't have to do that. You wouldn't have to look for a Judas, because from the very beginning, Adam and Eve was given one rule and they couldn't abide by that. Then they go a little bit farther. Cain and Abel were given rules, and Cain didn't abide by it. You come on down to the children of Israel, they barely get out of Egypt, have just witnessed the things that have gone on there, and they didn't abide by the rules. So mankind has always been predictable. And the thing about that is, it applies to us today. We're just as predictable as they were back then. So Samuel, and one of the predictable things about it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the lesson, because that's kind of the whole point of this anyway, is the fact that the things that we do today, the things that we do not do today that we should do, and the things that lead us to the way that in times past have led to complete almost apostasy of the church. Anyway, back to Samuel. Samuel assumes that the power of taking over Israel. And the Israelites see all the people around them that they have kings, and so they want a king. And God says, well, so go get him. It says that, they're not going to like what they're going to have. Because in chapter 8 and verse 9, in verse 7, the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken to the voice of the people, saying to thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. Howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. The way he protested solemnly to them was the fact that he tells them, we're going to get you a king because you have put up with this and you've won, so that we can be like everybody else. He said, but you're not going to like this king. You're not going to like the way he rules. You're not going to like the way a king operates. Because the king takes from his subjects. He tells his subjects what to do, and they have to abide by that. Well, they got done with that, and in verse, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, nay, but we will have a king over us. So then God says, well, go down to the Benjamin tribe, and there's a man there who is a man of Benjamin, whose name is Kish, the son of Abiel. And he has a son there whose name is Saul, who is he's described as a choice young man and a goodly. A choice young man and a goodly. Children of Israel are described how? God's chosen people. Saul is described as a choice young man and a goodly. So Samuel goes through the process of getting Saul and having him be king. Now Samuel is a advisor to, a confidant of Saul's. And is in such a position, he has a vested interest in the things that Saul does and the decisions that Saul makes, because he is there helping him make a part of it. And Saul is respectful of Samuel, and the fact that he knows that he came from God. But Samuel also knows that God is powerful, and he also understands the fact that this king, just as he described to the children of Israel, will not be what they want. When you get on over to a little further the story of Saul, and the children of Israel start to realize, and they say, we have sinned a great sin because we've asked for this king. But yet they still have a problem that they have to contend with him. So he's told to go down to conquer King Agag and his people, and to utterly destroy everything that's there. As we all know the story, this is where Saul's great downfall came. In verse 22 of chapter 15, and this is even after Saul has done some things as far as offering sacrifices and things that God has not approved of, and God says that God repented of making Saul king of Israel. Now, once again, rather than be an exception to the rule, Saul pretty much goes by the rule that mankind is very predictable. He fell to the influences of the people that he ruled and the people that were around him. He exists, his presence as the leader of Israel exists simply because they gave in to the temptation of being just like the people that were around him. This is his excuse, the fact that he gives in to the temptation of the people influencing him in his decisions. So in verse 22, when Samuel asked him about hearing the sheep and the oxen, what happened there, and he says, well, people made Saul. In verse 20, Saul said unto Samuel, yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought and the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, as sacrifices to the Lord thy God in Gilgal. And Samuel said in verse 22, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as a sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Rejected him from being king. Now, the point of this is, just as with Eli, and Samuel was involved with both of them and had an interest in both of their well-beings, you might say. Replaced by someone else. And one of the saddest things, or one of the things about it is that we when you talk about Samuel as far as concerning Saul, in verse 16, chapter 1, in verse 35 of chapter 15 rather, and then verse 1 of chapter 16, and Samuel came in 35, and Samuel came no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord repented that he had made Saul king over Israel. Samuel mourned for Saul. We need to keep that in mind, the mourning there, of the concern that Samuel had for the fact that Saul had been someone that had been a choice young man, a goodly person, someone that God had picked to carry out his will. But at this point, Samuel mourns for him. And then in verse 1 of chapter 16, and the Lord said unto Samuel, how long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? And he tells him to go to hunt the next king, which would be King David. Now, the point there is that Samuel had an interest in the well-being of Saul and the things that he did. But there came a point there when he had to draw the line, when God told him to draw the line and that this is the point that you will a suitable servant for me that no longer carries out the things that I have wanted him to do. And just as that happened then, it happens to us today. You know, the fact that Christ gave up what he gave up, and he has a vested interest in our interest in Christianity and the way that we should live our lives. And we are each indebted to everyone else. Now, how are we indebted to everyone else? The fact that Christ did what he did, you know, he paid a debt he did not owe because every one of us owed a debt we could not pay. And Paul, in chapter 1 of Romans, says that he talks about there before he says the verse that we are always, always quoting of not being ashamed of the gospel of Christ. He says that I am a debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. Now, the conversion of Paul, when he was on the road to Damascus, and we've all heard that before, he understood that he was indebted, that with the concept of Christianity comes an indebtedness on else, and that indebtedness comes from the fact that you are paying, that you were ransomed by Christ, and therefore you are indebted to everyone else in order to teach them whatever happens. In Ezekiel, therefore hear the word of my mouth and give them warning from me. When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest them not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thy hand. Now you go on over here, you know, the point there was if you failed to warn him, Ezekiel says if he failed to warn this guy, then what would happen? Or the Lord says that, what would happen? His blood would be at your hand. But if you did warn him, then you've done your duty to him. Your indebtedness had been paid in the fact that you did tell them the thing that you knew that could help them as far as their salvation. Now you go to the New Testament and the things, you know, when Paul said he's a debtor both to the Greeks and the barbarians, that means the whole spectrum of people, the wise and the unwise, and however you want to classify them. And Christ, you know, when he paid the debt there, and the debt that we each owe each other, in more ways than one. You know, we sometimes have too much of a consideration of the fact that whoever is being sent to preach or whatever is the one that really matters. But who really matters is everybody that's involved in it. If you, one of our big deals, I guess you'd say today, is that with parenting, and you hear this, and this is not from experience, by the way, but you hear parenting is, and one of the big things that they always bring up about a child, the child says, well, you don't come to my ball games or whatever. Well, that may be true or may not be true. But that is a mind as in what is happening there. If, for instance, for an example, if it's costing you $1,000 a year to finance that child, and and I'm not saying it's wrong or anything. The point I'm getting at is this parent-child relationship is the same as we have to each other as far as the things that are happening within the church, as far as the work that people does and the money that they contribute. But in the parent-child deal, if you're a parent and say it costs you $1,000 a year to carry out this endeavor that you're doing with this child or for this child, and you're working for $10 an hour, how many hours of your time, have you committed in that period of time to that child's deal? We sometimes get hung up on the minor things, but the whole picture is what matters. You know, you've invested, and the child needs to understand that you are doing to them just as someone has done for you, the investment of time and efforts in your well-being. And that investment is not measured in just an hour now and then at some function, but it's time invested of time out of your life in order to finance and support this other person. Now, in Christianity, there should be an indebtedness by all of us to each other, because we should each have invested, and each do have invested, something in the spiritual well-being of everyone that's present here, as well as everyone that's a member here, as well as everyone that walks anywhere outside. We are indebted to preach the gospel to them. We are to pay that debt in whatever way we best can do that. If we can teach or preach, if we can go or do, we need to do that. If we can work and contribute, that's a very important part too. If we can be benevolent and do whatever, that's a very important part too. But we have a tendency in this day and time, just as those people did in the past. You know, Mitch and I were talking the other night about the fact that, and anybody that's in the education system around, he said, we were talking about the I guess for lack of a better term, the mouth on some of these kids. The way they talk, the phrases that they use to describe each other, the way they address each other. But the way they talk is based in what? The way that they've been taught, the examples that they have observed. When Christ said that you are the light of the world and you are the salt of the earth, before he said that he was the light of the world. When he left, he said that you are the light of the world. With that light, with that saltiness, comes a responsibility to carry out a level of deportment that's been outlined and laid forth for us. Now, there was a thing the other morning on Good Morning America about the text messaging of that kids use, and this is not a sermon that's all down on kids, but that was what they were talking about. That and how most grown-ups or adults were in the dark about this. But the point they made was that this text messaging shorthand was bleeding over into their everyday schoolwork and into the way that they talked. Now, the fact of that matter is, the point of that is, that if we're not careful, we let things do that to us. We gradually become accustomed to something that at first is shocking, that later on is put up with, and is finally accepted. And you say, well, that doesn't happen to us. Well, what about the Dark Ages? The time when religion was suppressed, the time when, before the Restoration movement, which was involved in the fact that these people, someone stood up and said, the things, influences, the things that we've been taught are incorrect. We have an indebtedness, a vested interest in our well-being as well as those around us in order to correct these mistakes, correct these things that are being said and done that are not according to the will of God. And we need to be as lights of the earth and as lights of the world and salt of the earth. To be at the best of our abilities, not be as influenced by these outside forces as we are. You know, it's amazing to me. I was talking to somebody else the other day. It's amazing to me that, of course, if you go back to a time of, especially on television, and the fact of the matter is, everybody's on television and is influenced by the things and the stories that are on there. But things now, you're constantly bombarded by a promiscuity that 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or, and sure, back in the Andy Griffith days, would not even been tolerated, would have been considered, way, way out of line. Not by just church-going people, quote unquote, but by everybody. And the thing about it is, we've come to accept that. We've come to accept the promiscuity, the sexual promiscuity that is put forth to us and crammed down our throats to an extent that is absolutely ridiculous. And as I say, you put up with it, you're shocked by it at first, you put up with it for a little while, and then it's accepted. And in the end, it ruins you. It ruins not only us, but everybody that's around us. It takes the fact of the responsibility of our indebtedness to everyone to teach, because we have been taught to do that, and that their salvation may be just as available to them as to us. Now, the influences, the part about the text messaging is this. It bleeds over. It bleeds over when you don't really know that it's happening. You have to pay attention to what's going on. You have to discipline yourself in order to carry on the level of deportment, the being the light of the world, being the difference, being the salt of the earth, being the one that is as Saul was described, as a goodly person, being the one that is concerned because of the indebtedness that you owe to others, and because of the vested interest you have in the well-being of each and every one that's here tonight, each and every one that's a Christian and that's a member of this congregation. We fall down in that. We do not sometimes have a closeness and a realization of the vested interest that we have in each other's well-being and in each other's salvation. That's what gets us there. That's the thing that makes it work. So when you're considering, Samuel had an interest in Saul and Eli both, but they both faltered. They both in the end were rejected by God because of the things that they allowed to be influenced to them from outside. Christ, when he said he was the light of the world and the salt of the earth, that's a torch that he passed on to, first of all, his apostles, existed in his time. We have an indebtedness. We have a debt that was paid for us and a debt that we could not pay. We have a responsibility to carry out the actions and the message that Christ put forth to us. We can't avoid that. Just as he said in Ezekiel here, blood will be upon you if you do not teach them. And the same thing applies to us today. We need to pay more attention to what we have involved, what our interests are, and our time and our efforts involved in, and not be influenced, not be allowed to let our light be put out by those influences. To the invitation, you can come at this time.